It is strange how something as ordinary as a hotel hallway can feel completely alien when it's 3 in the morning and you re the only one walking through it. I remember that night with such clarity, not because anything particularly dramatic happened, at least not at first, but because every small detail seemed just a little bit off, like I had stumbled into a place that looked like Earth but wasn't quite real. I was staying at a roadside motel off I-70 in Missouri, the kind with buzzing fluorescent lights, outdated wallpaper, and a front desk clerk who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. It was a stopover on a long drive to Denver for a job interview, and I'd picked the motel because it was cheap, had a vacancy, and was too late to be picky. I was exhausted. I checked in, brushed my teeth, and crashed on top of the stiff white sheets with the TV murmuring in the background. I must have fallen asleep around midnight. What woke me wasn't a nightmare or a sound in my room. It was a rhythmic knocking, 3 slow, deliberate thuds, a pause, then 3 more. At first, I thought it was someone at my door, but the direction was off. It was coming from down the hall, just past my room, maybe 10 or 12 feet to the right. At that hour, everything sounded sharper, clearer. The sound echoed slightly, as if it were coming from something metallic. I got up, annoyed and a little nervous. My room faced the motel's main hallway, and when I peeked through the peephole, I didn't see anyone outside. Still, the knocking continued, steady and almost too perfectly spaced apart. It wasn't urgent like someone needing help, and it wasn't casual like someone bumping into something. It was purposeful. I cracked the door open, just enough to stick my head out. The hallway was lit by those awful overhead lights that hum just loud enough to make you aware of them. At the far end of the hall, the ice machine stood humming in its little alcove, half hidden in shadow. The knocking had stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. I was about to step back inside when I noticed something I hadn't seen before, an old wooden chair sitting directly in front of my door. It was facing me. No one was in it. It hadn't been there when I checked in, and it certainly wasn't the motel's furniture. It looked like it belonged in a school auditorium or an old kitchen, scratched up and dry from age. My stomach sank. I scanned the hallway again, but it was completely empty. Then I heard the soft click of something sliding across the floor. I looked down and saw a small square of white just inside the threshold of my room. A photo. My hand shook as I bent down to pick it up. It was a Polaroid, fresh enough that it still had a chemical scent. And in the picture was me, sound asleep on my side, with my arm under the pillow exactly the way I had been laying just minutes before. The image was dark, but the outline of my body, the pattern on the bedspread, even the TV remote by my hand, it was all unmistakable. Someone had taken it while I was sleeping. My breath caught in my throat. My first instinct was to slam the door shut and lock every bolt, which I did with shaking hands. I pressed my back against the door and stared at the photo, turning it over to see if anything was written on the back. It was blank. I wanted to call the front desk, to report it, to do something, but I didn't want to take my eyes off the door. Whoever left the chair, whoever took the photo, they had been inches from me, and I had slept through it. Eventually, I forced myself to pick up the motel phone. The clerk answered on the 3rd ring, sounding half asleep. I tried to explain what happened as calmly as I could, though my voice was trembling and my mouth was dry. He didn't seem surprised, just asked me what room I was in. When I told him, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Stay in your room. I'll come up and check." I sat on the edge of the bed, clutching the photo, waiting for him. It felt like an hour passed, but it must have only been 5 or 10 minutes. Then came a knock at the door, 2 sharp raps. I called out, asking if it was the front desk. No response. Another knock, slower this time. I looked through the peephole again. The hallway was empty. No one at the door. The chair was gone. So was the photo. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I kept every light on, TV volume low, and the deadbolt fastened tight. When the sun finally rose, I went straight to the front desk with my bags. The clerk from the night before was gone. A woman in her 50s was at the counter, cheerful and professional. I asked about the night clerk. She looked confused and told me they hadn't had a male employee on duty in months. When I told her what happened, she just shook her head and gave a nervous laugh like she thought I was joking. She told me there were no security cameras in the halls, too expensive to install, and that no one else had checked in on my floor that night. I left that motel and never looked back. But every so often, especially when I stay somewhere unfamiliar or hear ice clinking from down the hall, I think about that photo. I never found it again, but I swear I wasn't dreaming. I felt the texture of the film. I smelled the chemicals. And I saw my own body captured while I was unaware, helpless, vulnerable. I think about that chair, the way it was placed perfectly in front of my door, as if someone had been watching me for a long, long time. And worst of all, I wonder how many other people have heard the knocking ... and never opened the door. They gave me room 6 because it was cheap, and at that point in the night, I didn't care what it looked like. I had been driving for almost 14 hours straight, hauling dry goods out of Tennessee, and my eyes were starting to glaze over every time I passed a street lamp. I pulled off near a little town that barely had a name and parked outside a dusty 2-story roadside motel that looked like it had seen better decades. The neon sign flickered the word "open," but half the bulbs were dead. The lobby smelled like old cigarettes and pine sol, and the guy behind the counter, maybe in his 60s, yellow teeth, patchy gray beard, asked for $35 cash and slid me a key with a peeling number 6 sticker on it. He looked at me a little longer than I liked, but he wasn't rude, just ... off. I figured he was just one of those people who doesn't realize how long they stare. Room 6 was at the end of the hallway on the ground floor, all the way in the corner where the light didn't quite reach. The carpet was damp underfoot, and the walls had that weird yellow tint old motels get after years of neglect. When I stepped inside, the first thing I noticed was the silence. Not peace and quiet, no humming a sea, no distant traffic, no TV through thin walls. It was dead silence, the kind that makes you hyper-aware of your own breathing. I set my bag down and looked around. The room was small, maybe 10 by 12 feet, with one queen bed, a dresser with no TV on it, and a bedside table with a cracked lamp. No window. At first I thought maybe it was just behind the curtain, but there was no curtain, no rod, just a bare wall. I tried to call the front desk to ask if I could switch rooms. No dial tone. I pulled out my phone, but I had no bars. Not one. Not even a weak Wi-Fi signal to grab. I stepped back into the hallway. Nothing. I walked a few doors down, got one flickering bar, but the moment I stepped back toward room 6, it vanished again. I should have left then, but I was too tired to argue. I figured I'd crash for a few hours and be back on the road before sunrise. I locked the door, wedged a chair under the knob force of habit, and tried to sleep. That's when I heard it. Breathing. At first I thought it was just my imagination exhaustion playing tricks, but the sound didn't match mine. It was slower, deeper, and raspy, like whoever it belonged to had a cold or had been crying for hours. It came from the wall behind the headboard, like someone was standing right behind it, inches away. There was no thudding, no banging, no movement. Just breathing. Inhale, pause, exhale. Long, steady, deliberate. I held my breath to make sure it wasn't an echo. It kept going. I sat up and leaned in close, ear nearly pressed to the wall. The sound didn't change. It didn't react. It just ... kept breathing. I whispered, "Hello?" Nothing. Just another slow inhale. I didn't sleep. I lay there, still as I could, counting every breath I heard that didn't belong to me. At one point I tried banging on the wall. It stopped for maybe 10 seconds, then resumed. I even shouted. Same result. No answer, no retaliation. Just that same quiet, hollow sound of lungs filling and emptying just on the other side of the plaster. Around 5, mate finally started to peek through the bottom of the door, and I got up to leave. I didn't bother showering or brushing my teeth. I just grabbed my bag, took one last look at that blank wall, and left. At the front desk, a different guy was working clean cut, younger, looked like he'd just opened up. I asked if I could talk to the owner or whoever had checked me in the night before. He blinked and told me no one worked nights anymore, not since the old man died last fall. I told him that was impossible. I checked in just hours ago. He shrugged like it wasn't the first time he'd heard something weird, and said the night guy had a heart attack in that very office back in October. Before I left, I asked one more question. Why doesn't room 6 have a window? The clerk paused, just a second too long, then looked down and said, that room used to be a maintenance closet. We don't usually rent it out. Surprised they gave it to you. I didn't say anything else. I just nodded and walked out to my truck. But even now, months later, I still remember the sound of that breathing. Long, wet, human. And every now and then, in the middle of a long drive, when I stop for the night in some random town, I sleep in the cab of my truck instead. Because no matter how tired I am, I can't stop wondering if the thing behind that wall is still there. Or worse, if it ever left. It started with something so small, I almost ignored it. A cleaning lady, probably in her 50s, slightly hunched, with dark circles under her eyes and gloves that looked like they hadn't come off all day. She stopped me just as I was dragging my bag toward room 3, the key jangling on the chipped plastic fob. Her eyes darted between me and the door, and without even saying hello, she said, "You should ask for a different room. Please, don't stay in that one." Her voice was low, not conspiratorial, but more like someone who had been living with something they couldn't shake for far too long. I paused, caught off guard. I asked her why, but she just looked past me, whispered, "They shouldn't rent that room anymore," and walked away pushing her cart. Normally, I would have shrugged it off, figured she was just superstitious or maybe hated the owner. But something about her face, the tired, resigned expression, stuck with me. Still, I'd been driving for 12 hours and all I wanted was a shower, some greasy takeout, and a bed. I unlocked the door and stepped into room 3. It looked like any budget motel room, faded carpet, water-stained ceiling, bed with the same comforter pattern you find in 100 roadside motels. But it was clean enough, and I figured whatever haunted her didn't haunt me. That first night was when things started to feel wrong. Not scary, exactly just off. The kind of wrong that crawls in the back of your skull and tells you something doesn't belong, but you can't quite put your finger on it. The bathroom mirror was warped, bending reflections just slightly at the corners. The room smelled faintly of mildew, and something else I couldn't place something, like copper or rusted metal. I figured it was just the pipes. Around 2:30 a.m., I woke up to the sound of crying. Not loud, not wailing. It was a kind of muffled crying you hear through a thick wall, choked and barely audible, but unmistakable. It was coming from the left side of the room, through the wall where, as far as I could tell, there was no adjoining room. I sat up in bed, holding my breath. The crying continued for another 10, maybe 15 minutes. It sounded like a woman. Not hysterical, just broken, gutted. I tried to shake it off. Old buildings creak, voices carry, pipes moan. But then I heard scratching. Faint at first, like fingernails, softly dragging along drywall. It started behind the bed, then moved up, then sideways, like someone or something was slowly tracing the outline of the room from the other side of the wall. I pressed my ear to the wall, half hoping I was imagining it. But no, I heard it again, scratch, 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 then silence. I backed away, heart pounding, and turned every single light on. I didn't sleep again that night. The next morning, I went to the front desk and asked if anyone had been in the neighboring room. The clerk didn't even check the computer. He just looked at me and said, "There's nothing on either side of room 3. Storage on the left, laundry on the right." I asked about the crying. He shrugged. I brought up the scratching, and his smile thinned. "It's an old building," he said. "Sometimes things shift." That night, I couldn't stop thinking about what the cleaning lady said. I tried to ignore it, played music on my phone, tried watching TV, but around 2 a.m., it started again. The crying, then the scratching. This time it sounded more frantic, like fingers clawing harder, faster. It wasn't just a sound, it felt like the wall itself was vibrating, like something on the other side was desperate to get through. I jumped out of bed, grabbed my bag, and decided I'd had enough. But just as I opened the door, I froze. Across the hall, slightly ajar, was a door marked Maintenance, Do Not Enter. A dim red light flickered behind it. But what caught my attention wasn't the door, it was the faint sound of breathing, slow and wheezy, coming from right behind me. I turned. Room 3's door was still open, but the room looked darker than it had seconds ago. Not dimmer darker, like the light itself had been swallowed. In the morning, I packed up and checked out without a word. The day clerk handed me my receipt and said, almost casually, "Sorry about room 3. You're not the first to say something." I asked why they still rented it out. He shrugged and said, "Owner says it's just stories. Nothing ever happens during the day." I stood there for a second, then asked, "What happened in that room?" He paused, then lowered his voice. "There was a woman, years ago, stayed long-term. Said she kept hearing a baby crying through the walls. Said it wouldn't let her sleep. One morning, housekeeping found her in the bathtub. Sad she couldn't take the noise anymore. That was the last time I stayed in a room without checking reviews first. But sometimes when I'm alone in a hotel room late at night, I still catch myself listening, wondering if I'll hear it again. The crying, the scratching, the soft sound of nails against drywall, begging to be let out. And every time I pass by a room with a faded number and a silence too deep to trust, I remember the cleaning lady's voice. "Don't look in room 3.